Oh, difficult.
Stop. Stop reading that book. It's immoral, and I can't allow you to continue. And furthermore, the person who has been mentoring you has values we don't approve of. She must go. That's censorship, muzzling the message and the messenger. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm Jean Martin, the chair of the Forums That Matter Committee, a service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. It's my pleasure to welcome both our in-person and our virtual audience. Following our panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A from 9:30 to 10. Marlene will pass a microphone for our in-person audience. Our virtual audience members can put questions in the Q&A box. Please be sure your phones are off or in airplane mode. This program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website, uucleveland.org. Our panelists today are very knowledgeable about censorship. Felton Thomas Jr. was appointed director of the Cleveland Public Library in 2009. Since then, he has launched initiatives addressing community needs in technology, education, and economic development. Felton earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Nevada and his master's in Library of Science from the University of Hawaii. He has served on many boards, earned many awards, and served as president of the Public Library Association. Meryl Johnson is a retired teacher with 40 years of teaching experience in the Cleveland Public Schools. She's a graduate of Glenville High School in the Cleveland District, earned her BA from Kent State University, and her Master's of Education from Cleveland State. She was elected to the State Board of Education in 2016 and re-elected in 2020. She is an avid student advocate and hosts a radio show on WRUW 91.1 FM called It's About Justice, Saturday afternoons at 1 o'clock. Owen Ganor is a senior at Rocky River High School and is active in social justice issues. Under the guidance of Meryl Johnson, he and other students formed the group Students Promoting Equity and Knowledge, known as SPEAK. The group addresses education and measures attempting to censor some aspects of history. Owen was presented the 2021 Student Diversity Champion Award by the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio. Our moderator is Margaret Nash. She retired from the faculty at the University of California, Riverside, and has published 3 books and dozens of articles on the history of women's education, the history of art and music education, the role of public education in the dispossession of Native Americans, and gender and citizenship in the early republic. Her most recent work is on the history of LGBTQ teachers' rights. And now I'll turn the forum over to Margaret.
Thank you, Jean. Good morning, and thank you all for coming to this forum on such an important topic. I'm honored to facilitate this discussion with our terrific panel of speakers. Before I pose some questions to the speakers, let me set a little bit of context. We'll be talking here about both public schools and public libraries. Censorship in schools can take many forms. States and districts can prohibit what is taught. They can restrict who can teach by, for instance, firing LGBTQ teachers, and or restrict what books are on school library shelves. Most of us have probably heard about Florida's Don't Say Gay law, an example of censorship of school curriculum. But Florida is not alone. In 2022, 36 different states introduced 137 gag orders. Most of these gag order bills have targeted teaching about race, while a growing number target LGBTQ+ identities. Many school districts, including here in Ohio, have policies forbidding discussion of anything that might be considered political or religious, severely limiting teachers' options even without a statewide gag order. In addition to school curriculum, censorship is happening in school libraries. Last month, the Washington Post reported that at least 10 states passed laws limiting what books can be in school libraries. And in states without these laws, districts are passing policies that bar certain books, most often those focused on issues of gender and sexuality. Rather than risk violating these policies or stirring up problems in districts without these policies, some school librarians are self-censoring. In the Post survey, librarians said they were less willing to buy books dealing with difficult aspects of US history, race, racism, and gender identity. According to the American Library Association and PEN America, of the thousands of books targeted for removal from schools, the vast majority were written by or about people of color and LGBTQ people. The top two most frequently banned books from school libraries in 2022 were Genderqueer and All Boys Aren't Blue, both written by queer people of color. Others in the top 10 include works by Native American writer Sherman Alexie, African Americans Toni Morrison and Angie Thomas, Latina writer Ashley Perez, and Afghan American Khaled Hosseini. Outside of schools, public libraries face pressure too. The American Library Association reported 681 challenges to more than 1,600 titles last year. In August, people in Jamestown, Michigan voted to defund its public library because it contained books with LGBTQ themes. Conservative groups are encouraging members to run for public library boards in order to limit what material will be on shelves and what programs will be offered. Around the country, there have been protests of the popular drag story time, effectively shutting down these programs in many places. One library was faced with the loss of insurance coverage because of these protests, jeopardizing their ability to stay open at all. The ripple effects of censorship spread far and wide. We're here today to talk about the situation here in Ohio. So I'm going to pose questions to each of our panelists for about the first 25 minutes, and then open the discussion up for questions from you. So I'm going to start with two questions from Meryl. The first one is, what have discussions been like, both on the state school board as well as with members of the public, regarding restrictions on curriculum or restrictions on what is permitted to be talked about in classroom settings?
Thank you so much. I just want to say I appreciate being invited to this forum. I have promoted you many times on my radio show, and thank you for the good work you're doing. I want to begin, having taught for 40 years, I believe in visual aids. So I'm going to start with a little book called Ruby Bridges Goes to School, 32 pages, written by Ruby Bridges herself. And the Moms of Liberty in Tennessee made every effort to ban this book. Why they want to ban it? Because of the following picture. They didn't like the fact that there was a picture of white people holding signs that said bad things. But the truth is, this really happened. Okay, we're talking about being honest about history. As far as discussions on the state board is 19 members, 8 are appointed by the governor. And in response to the murder of George Floyd in 2021, 3 other board members and myself decided that we needed to put together, in 2020, that we needed to put together a resolution as a response to that. And so we developed a resolution called Resolution to Condemn Racism and to Advance Equity and Opportunity for Black students, Indigenous students, and other students of color. And we had a number of whereases that spoke to the importance of having culturally responsive curriculum. I just want to share those whereases with you. we said, whereas a culturally responsive curriculum reflects the history and background of all students and empowers students to value all cultures, not just their own. And whereas research has shown that a culturally responsive curriculum can motivate students of color to a higher level of academic achievement, and in many cases increase the graduation rate of previously disengaged students. And in our resolve, what we asked all school districts to do was to do an audit of their curriculum, of their professional development, and so forth, to make sure that it was equitable and it was fair. Now, that resolution was passed by the state board by a vote of 12 to 5 with 1 abstention in May of 2020. Unfortunately, later on that year, we had a new member elected, and he decided that he didn't like the resolution. And so he put together a resolution to have this one rescinded. And the sad part about this story is that the 8 appointed members were threatened that if they did not vote to rescind, they would be kicked off the board. And as a result, 2 members, our president at the time, Laura Kohler, and another member, Eric Hockler, got a call from the governor's office and were told to resign. So at the end of that meeting, I said, you know what, people are still going to do the work because the work is important. Why do I share that story with you? Because the question said, what conversations are you having on the board? We don't have any conversations as a result of this resolution being rescinded. But other people do understand that they need to have conversations. I wanted to share with you, I presented to the Cuyahoga County Citizens Advisory Council on Equity, and they put together a resolution against censorship. And just to read one of their whereases, they said, whereas suppressing or prohibiting discussion of systemic racism in our schools can only result in the continued ignorance of the reality of the experience of non-whites. And so they're resolved, which I really appreciate. They said, be it resolved that all members of the Ohio General Assembly should immediately withdraw all support for House Bills 322 and 327. And they also said all schools throughout Cuyahoga County and the state of Ohio should teach the facts of history rather than a distorted, limited version of history that diminishes and devalues the lived experience of the non-white residents of the county, the state, and the United States. And then also, Berea School District also put together a resolution. I just want to share a little bit of their resolution because the conversation is happening and the work is being done, no matter what the State Board of Education says. Berea City School District said, whereas the legislation would have a chilling effect, and they were referring to 322 and 327, the censorship bills. And they said, whereas the legislation would have a chilling effect on dialogue and inject fear and instability into a system of public education that is already underfunded, understaffed, and under tremendous strain, whereas these bills seek to place fear in teachers so they reconsider culturally responsive lessons and think twice about providing each child with what is in their best educational interests, whereas educators and districts will be penalized for non-compliance with the provisions of these bills. And just to add my own editorial comment, in case you didn't know, the penalty for teaching the truth about history, teachers could lose their license and school districts could lose their funding. That's how, and we're talking about higher ed also. So it's serious, it's serious. And there are other whereas I wanted to share with you. It said, whereas these bills will discourage careers in education, impede Ohio's ability to attract well-qualified candidates to fill open positions, and will exacerbate the severe staffing shortages Ohio public schools currently face. And I chose to end with that, the reading with that whereas, because we are losing teachers. And we're losing teachers as a direct result of this ridiculous legislation. Now, 322, 327 didn't pass. They never went to the governor, and it had a lot to do with the advocacy, with the many organizations that were coming out against these bills, because they understand how important it is for our students to learn the truth about history so that they can go out and be the kinds of citizens that they need to be to advocate for change in this world filled with systemic racism. And so I think when you talk about what is important for our students and for our teachers, we need to recognize that the truth, it's all about the truth. It's all about the truth. I just want to read the preamble from our resolution because I think this preamble to this resolution that we put together was written by our former superintendent, Paulo Di Maria. And I really appreciate the words that he put together in our resolution. He said, as our nation grapples with the hard truths of racism and inequality, we are listening with broken hearts and engaging with determined spirits. We acknowledge that Ohio's education system has not been immune to these problems. And while we earnestly strive to correct them, we have a great deal of work left to do. And with that, I'm going to end.
Thank you very much for highlighting how challenging this situation is, but also the hopefulness of some districts who are writing these policies that are helping protect our teachers and students. In the Q&A, maybe somebody will ask Meryl more questions about what legislation is in the works and what's hopeful and what's most scary. Turning now to Felton Thomas from the Cleveland Public Library. So what kinds of requests has the Cleveland Public Library faced to have books pulled from the shelves, or requests to stop certain kinds of programming, such as drag story time? And how has the library responded to any such requests?
So we've been very fortunate when we find something to knock on wood here, because I've been the director for 14 years, and we have not had one request for reconsideration of any book that we've had on the shelf. Oh, yeah. But you know, last year, and obviously around us in the country, we've seen a lot of things happening. And at the beginning of last year, we decided we were going to bring Nicole Hannah-Jones to speak to Clevelanders in November. And this was during the hubbub of HB 327, the Divisive Concepts Bill, and we recognized that the 1619 Project is their target. Nicole Hannah-Jones is their idea of, you know, the boogeyman of critical race theory and all of those things. So we fully assumed there was going to be some pushback, or we have some protests or something of that nature, at least, you know, something put forward. And November came, she did her presentation, it went really well. I heard nothing but great things from all of the community members who saw her, and everybody talked about it. And I was like, okay, well, we got past that. And then January came, and we've got a public office request, basically a public records request, to have anything around Nicole Hannah-Jones that we had put forward or contracted everything from a conservative media outlet, who we could understand was writing a very negative article, of course, of which they did. And the article basically was based on the fact that how dare Nicole Hannah-Jones make money off of this book, right? She's making too much money, right? And these and folks like the libraries and universities are paying her and all of that. But overall, really, the article really didn't go anywhere. We haven't heard any more protests, or we didn't get any calls around the article or anything of that nature. So, knock on wood again, we have been very fortunate in this space. Unfortunately, many libraries across the country have not.
Could you talk about that a little bit, just how lucky we are compared to what's happening in other places in the state and around the country? And how the concerns, even if they haven't popped up too much here in Cleveland, has it shaped, for instance, how the library thinks about acquisitions of new material?
Well, it hasn't stopped us from doing what we do. We're the third largest public research library in the country. And we feel like we need to collect what we need to collect no matter what. And we're not going to be, kind of bullied into thinking any different way. However, I see it with my colleagues across the country. They are being bullied in public school libraries and in public libraries across the country. We have had, just in public schools, 2,000 books be basically banned in those schools. And the kind of, you may assume that the state that is leading the charge is Texas, actually, right? There's a councilman who is kind of in the library world, kind of has become infamous because they asked him, what are we going to do with all these banned books? And he said, let's burn them. Right? Not even thinking about the whole idea of what that sounds like. It's just kind of his mindset. And in another library system in Kansas, basically the Mid-Continent Public Library, the board, in trying to stop the programming and all of the books that were being purchased by the library director, who had the ability to do it, just said, well, we do have the power of the purse, so we're not going to give you any money. And basically, they just held the budget with that, cut the budget in half so they could just pay for staff. So this is happening across the country. I could give you many, many more stories about how this is being done. But there has been this infiltration into library boards by folks who want to take control of the board, and the Mid-Continent was a classic example of that.
So would you recommend to people here to try to get on a library board near them?
Absolutely. It is,
or a school board?
Or a school board.
Right,
it is unbelievably important because, as Meryl said, it can take as one board member being put into a spot, and that person then takes the lead on what becomes very, very divisive.
Thank you. And I'm sure the group will have many more questions for you in just a few minutes, but now we're going to hear from Owen, a current high school student. So as a high school student, have you been aware of censorship issues in the general culture, and how has that awareness affected you in your school?
Well, I've mostly been aware of these issues when we've been talking about the censorship in education, in particular regarding the House Bills 322 and 327. Thankfully, those have not passed yet, but it definitely caused some fear in the teachers in my school district that I know of. When they were first introduced, the school attorney met with all of our history and English teachers to have their curriculum looked over to make sure that it would be not divisive, but before anything passed, which is an interesting decision and kind of undermines the power of our teachers that they have in forming young students. And however, Rocky River, thankfully, has a fantastic history department. All of our history teachers have continued teaching the same material that they have, and many have increased the number of topics that are considered divisive by many more conservative people. My response to that, I'm not the most outgoing person, but I couldn't really sit quiet while our teachers were even considered to have their curriculum rewritten or censored. And I love being at forums like this so I can talk about that student perspective, which we don't always get. Yeah.
Are there topics that used to be in the curriculum or discussed in classes, even if they weren't part of the official curriculum, that aren't included anymore? Are there topics you see teachers steering classroom discussions away from? And how have you and other students reacted?
The issue that comes to mind first is diversity education. For many years, Rocky River had a good relationship with the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio. But in 2020, they ended that contract because so many people in the community were attacking the school board, saying that it was misinformation, it was making their students, their children, uncomfortable somehow when we were talking about different sexual orientations or gender identities, everything. And the school's response to that was that they were going to handle all diversity education internally and take care of it themselves. As of 2020, that has not happened. It is 2023, and we have not had any diversity programming at all, which is terrible. In my opinion, as a student, it cannot help us at all. We have a less good understanding of ourselves and our peers and as society as a whole. It's just our decisions that we make going forward will be less informed. We'll have less contextual information to make those decisions, and it just spirals from there. If we're talking about history specifically, like I said, our history department is fantastic, and thankfully there have been no changes yet. But I know that teachers are concerned because there is still some community backlash towards teaching, real history. And I know for our public library, we have gotten some complaints about books that are on the shelves, and like the drag story hour, which still ended up happening, thankfully. But I know that the speaker she did not feel safe at all entering and leaving the library because there was a community protest.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you. One of the common threads that I see across what the three of you are saying is that, well, yes, legislation makes a huge difference. It doesn't take legislation to also make a difference, because even the threat of it or the change in climate, people are changing their behavior regardless. So we need to be active on both fronts, I think. Okay, one last question from me to each of the three of you, and we'll start again with Meryl. So briefly, what would you most like the public to know about how censorship is or is not affecting Ohio public schools and public libraries?
Well, I think what I really want the public to know is about a bill that has been proposed called Senate Bill 1. And Senate Bill 1 would take most of the power away from the State Board of Education and turn education over to the governor's office in a new department called the Department of Education and Workforce. And it's dangerous. It's really a dangerous thing for that to happen, because this is the same legislature that proposed 322 and 327. This is the same legislature that has not fairly funded schools since 1991, when the issue was first proposed. And this is a legislature that doesn't really believe in the work that our teachers are doing. And when you look at the governor's recent State of the State address, he talked about literacy. When I was teaching, people always say boys don't read. I bought books. You know how teachers, we spend all our own money? I bought books where my African-American boys could see themselves. And they would ask me, could they take the books home to read and to bring? I said, as long as you bring them back. My point is that education being turned over to the governor's office is the worst thing that could happen in the state of Ohio. Not just taking the power away from the state board, but local boards won't have a whole lot of power either. This is something that all of you should be very concerned about. I brought an excellent piece from Representative Juanita Brent with the phone numbers of the Senate Education Committee. They're on the back table, but we've got to make phone calls and let them know you will not silence our voices. You will not silence our voices. Education belongs in the hands of local boards and in the hands of the State Board of Education and the Ohio Department of Education. So that is what I'm really concerned about. I'm hoping that everybody in here will make calls and let them know you will not do that to our K-12 education.
Thank you. It's really important information, and I know we will all take that to heart. Felton, what would you most like people to know? What would you like the public to know about the current situation?
I will very much agree with Meryl on that. But I would also say, while the divisive concepts bill didn't pass last year, it is not going away, right? And it will be coming back. Libraries were a part of that, not only schools, but basically any education, institution was a part of that bill. And so I think we have to be vigilant in recognizing that the folks who are standing behind this this fight they have, this crusade they have to really be divisive, while they say they're trying to stop everyone from being divisive, is not going to go away. And those folks who are leading it are there, and they are more determined than ever to find ways to put a spotlight on them in many cases, because this is what it does. It allows them to get their cred, but it's also, they truly believe in this, and we've got to fight it at every turn.
Thank you. Owen, do you have thoughts?
I do. The biggest thing that I would have to say is there is no way that limiting information and exposure for students can help us become better people and better citizens. It is simply impossible. Limiting the context of history and our world, it leads to the decisions that we will make in the future being less informed, like I said before. And if all of these things were to pass, we would create a generation of students who are less thoughtful and less understanding of themselves and their entire world. And I think it's important that everyone, if you can, speak at your school board meetings, especially because I know in Rocky River, at least, the general population is either supportive or indifferent to diversity, education, and truthful history, but it's the other side that is more outspoken. And we need more people like you to speak at those board meetings to explain why we simply cannot let this information to be censored.
And I just need to mention one more thing. Owen was courageous enough to speak at his school board meeting during a time when parents were coming, and I think the headline in the paper was "Crazed Parents Storm the School Board." That's not mine, that belongs to the media, but Owen was courageous enough to speak at a school board meeting, and I just wanted to say good for you.
Clapping. My huge thanks to the three panelists, and thank you, Jean, for inviting me to be a part of this. And now I'm handing it over to Jean and to you for further questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Margaret, and all the speakers for a very stimulating discussion. I want to just say that I participated in the Nicole Hannah-Jones Zoom, and it was very interesting. And the library gave out free books of the 1619 project, which I thought was a very nice touch. Marlene will now pass the mic around to our in-person audience. And when you ask a question, please hold the mic close to your mouth so our virtual audience can also hear. We'll look at the Q&A box online for questions from our virtual audience. Also, if you'd like to be added to our weekly email notification list, there'll be a form passed around and fill out the clipboard for it. We'd also like to know how you heard about it. And online viewers can add your names and emails in the chat box. Looks like we have quite a few questions.
Make sure you hold it like this. I'm going to ask who's buried in Grant's tomb type of question to Owen. In the course of the teachings, if a student who took a different point of view wanted to have floor time to express his view, would that be granted?
I think that, yes, it would be granted. I do not think any of our history teachers would be be so hypocritical as to censor them. And I think it's for that reason that they would let that student speak, whether or not they or the rest of the class agreed. That said, if it takes a hateful approach, that would not be allowed in a classroom. We're all allowed to express our own views so long as we are not hateful towards other people or ideas.
But you mean hateful in dialogue or in language or the speaker's attitude?
Yes to both. I can't say that I've had experience with that in class. But I feel like what I'm talking about is if we were talking about, say, a good example, if we're talking about American involvement in World War II, that's not a issue that you can talk about both sides of as if they are equally respectable. That leads to misinformation and just overall confusion. So if a student were to, I guess, I can't even imagine this happening, but try to take another side on that issue, I don't think that would be necessarily supported by a teacher, and frankly, nor should it. But if we're talking about a current events issue, those different ideas are welcome. And while the House Bills 322 and 327 have not passed, we're still allowed to have debates like that in a classroom setting if they are respectful towards everyone.
Mr. Thomas, if I were someone who wanted to protest a book in your library, if I said I am absolutely opposed to the Bible being in your library, it offends me. How does that happen? What do I do? What do you do?
So what you do is put forward a reconsideration form, basically putting forward your argument for why this book shouldn't be in the library. Then our collection staff will examine it. They will kind of go through what the argument is for why the book shouldn't be there. They will pass that on to leadership, and then leadership will pass on our decision to the board, and then the board will send forward a response to your letter.
In the books that are being proposed to be banned, is this procedure being followed in the state of Ohio?
So every library has a different kind of reconsiderations placed on how they do it. It may be just the director making the decision in some libraries. It could be the board making the decision, but there is always a process that it goes through for the most part. One of the things that our state librarian did and our kind of state library association did 2 years ago, when we really started to see a number of these challenges happening in Texas and in Florida, we started to work with us, especially our small libraries. There are 251 library systems in the state of Ohio, right? So many of them are very small. And in those areas, they can be bullied very easily, right? And so many of them didn't have a process. They hadn't had anyone come to them and try to get books taken out of the library. So they were kind of just like, didn't know what to do. And some of them actually just kind of took the book away or hid it in the back or did whatever they needed to do. But what we have been working with them on is basically learning, here's your process. The American Library Association has provided you with the understanding of what is censorship, and then you work through a process. And luckily, now basically almost all of our library systems in the state have a process, and they're working their process. And it helps them. Thanks for the question, because the process is the most important thing. When you don't have a process to work it through, you can just be challenged on how you're going to react. And many of those folks are dealing with people they know who live down the street from them.
First of all, thanks to our three panelists and to Maggie for really one of the best forums that we've had here. And I wanted to ask you, so Mr. Thomas, you talked about censorship in the public library. And Meryl, you talked about it in public schools, and Owen sort of in Rocky River. But my question is, all of these struggles are really part of something larger. A cultural shift. How would you describe that something larger, of which censorship in trying to government control of school curriculum is really simply, they're important struggles, but they're symptoms of the, I hope I'm being pretty vague, but anyway, please.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. There is a national movement to dismantle public education. And it's been going on for a long time. It's directly related to the entrance of school vouchers in Ohio, charter schools, which took money from public education to allow people to leave. And it's directly related now to the bill that didn't pass, thank goodness, but it's certainly going to come back up. And it's being called the backpack bill, universal vouchers. Senator Matt Huffman wants to have every family in Ohio, no matter what the income, no matter how wealthy they are, for all of them to receive $5,500 for K to 8 and $7,500 for students in 9 through 12 to be able to leave the public schools and take public tax dollars to go to private or religious schools. That, I'm sure, is going to come up again this year, but it's all because of a national movement to destroy public education. The censorship bills, they are running teachers away, and parents are pulling their students out of public schools to go to other schools so where they can learn what they want to learn. It's just, it's very distressing, but we have to keep fighting back. We have to maintain and hold on to our public education. And I just need to mention that our national teacher organizations were very much involved in this fight against censorship. The American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, president, that's my national union, she made it very clear that they were putting more money into their defense funds, and she was letting educators know we have your back. So it's terrible, but it is a national movement to destroy public education.
I could just add to that. I think Merle's point is well taken in the sense that, and your question is important, because while there has been this kind of broader kind of attack, the institutions who are working on this, who are dealing with it, have been siloed. Libraries really haven't been working with schools. Schools really haven't been working with museums or other institutions that are dealing with this. All of the cultural organizations or educational organizations deal with it on like a case-by-case basis, instead of looking at it, how do we kind of create a larger thought around this? And you don't see, while many funders are very much in support of these things, you don't see a larger funding group coming in and doing the anti-ads against censorship, which we need to have to cover us so that we can speak.
Yeah, and just to add, there's a lot of money flowing from organizations like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which writes model legislation and sends it to dues-paying members in each state. That's why you have the same bills happening all over the country, basically identical. And those bills get sent to namely Republicans, I'm gonna call it out, in these states. And sometimes they don't even change the bill. They found bills that had the American Legislative Exchange Council's logo on it. They hadn't even bothered to write it. Sometimes they don't read the bills because they're coming straight to them and they put it right out there. So the Heritage Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, do your homework, look up ALEC, A-L-E-C exposed, and you will find out a lot of information. The Stand Your Ground bill, law that was passed in lame duck a couple of years ago. The Senate Bill 5, back when we fought against that. All these bills are coming from the same place. And so we have to know who the enemy is and do our homework so that we can adequately fight these battles.
Yeah, I feel like as well, so much of it is about controlling what is happening just in general. Like I feel that as a student with people trying to control what we are being taught in especially English and history classes. I mean, I can't really imagine a scenario where someone would challenge a math class unless people are so against Arabic numerals, but I don't know what we do without those at this point. But I think in general, it is about control over what is happening, what is being talked about, and what is being thought about. Because if you gradually remove the trickier spots in our history, and people will forget about those, and suddenly less people are going to be questioning what legislation is happening and what our politicians, our elected officials are choosing to do, which is dangerous. Our country was founded on the basis of questioning an unjust system. And if you remove the historical context that gives us information to make those decisions, suddenly, what are we going to do? We're not going to have people who are willing to question that system, and it's not going to change. And we all know we need change immediately. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
My question is, it would be terrible for the governor's office to be in charge of education. Would they just run to the state boards and local school boards and try to get in there? Is there any publicizing going on in those areas?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question.
I think it would be terrible for the governor's office to have, say so over education. If that didn't happen, would they run to local boards and state boards and try to control those people?
They're trying to do that now. That's why Senate Bill 1 has been proposed. So that's why that is in the works. They're trying to do that now. They want to have control over everything and leave the State Board of Education with, I think, about 4 responsibilities we would have. Something called territorial transfers and licensure and hiring or dismissing the state superintendent and personnel issues. Those would be the only issues that we would be left with instead of dealing with standards and curriculum. And there's a lot that we do that's very important for the state. So if Senate Bill 1 were to pass, and I'm sure this group here, you're going to keep it from passing because you're going to make phone calls. But if it were to pass, we're talking about also money, federal and state dollars. A lot of money comes into Ohio for education, and that would be in the hands of the governor. Yes, it's a bad idea, and we have to fight against it.
Thank you so much for being here. And I was curious about something on the news the other day. A family from, a couple from Upper Sandusky, did anybody see that? That it's either homeschooling or charter school?
Homeschool. Yeah.
Homeschool. And I hope this isn't going on too much, but they were teaching Nazism and saluting Hitler and all this nonsense. And how do you see homeschooling falling into this realm of that oversight, if you can, or lack thereof?
You're talking about with Senate Bill 1, or you're saying now?
No, this is just something I saw the other day on the news.
Yeah, I saw that. There are regulations for homeschooling. So, homeschooling, you don't just go and do whatever you want. The Ohio Department of Education does monitor homeschooling. And I don't know exactly how they're going to deal with that, but they are, the Ohio Department of Education does monitor, and not closely, but there are regulations for homeschooling. So that's the best answer I can give you for that one.
Good morning. My children both went to Shaker Heights School, so gives me a little credit, right? Really to Owen and the non-grader people in the audience, right? Technology has enabled the organization that Ms. Johnson talked about to organize all of the disparate groups, to tie them all together, and Dr. Thomas referenced that we're all operating in silos. We're quiet because we're not throwing bombs, right? But what can technology do? And how to organize all of us. We need to hear from the students are our future. And you guys know how that works because you're natives. We all are figuring it out. But in terms of how effective our thinking is, how do we use the technology of today? And it's just going to get better and better to do this work.
Thank you for that question. I think it is, so we all know that technology can be dangerous because it can give a voice to people who are not trying to help anyone else except themselves. That said, we can use technology in a similar way to kind of join forces. And if with like-minded people, you can form organizations like this one. I'm sure you have online website. I'm not the most tech savvy person, but just to join people like that, or you have your other interest groups and public organizations that are present on social media, for example, so they can share their voice as well. But I think what's most important is to have all of those different organizations online unified. Because if everyone might be saying their message separately, but with a smaller audience, that might not be as helpful. But if we can use technology somehow, and again, I'm not sure all the ins and outs of how that would actually happen, but to bring together all of these different people and organizations to have a united front against those individuals who are trying to just get attention for themselves.
And I have to mention that I'm very thankful for Facebook. People who know me know that I post a lot, and I use Facebook to put things out like this beautiful piece by Representative Juanita Grant that I have on the back table, which gives you action steps to fight against Senate Bill 1. I have, I think, more than 1,000 friends, and so there's a lot of people who have access to my page, and so I really do use Facebook a lot to get important information out to people, so I appreciate it.
I have a couple of questions from our virtual attendees, and here's a really interesting one from Bob. Bob says students have free speech rights, and courts have upheld the right of students to speak uncomfortable truths on social networking sites as long as they don't disrupt the educational environment. So, can students demand the right to access books? Can students sue on their own behalf to demand a cessation of censorship?
I think so, actually. In a public school setting, like you said, there is legislation in place. There are rights in place for us students to have. I mean, coming to mind immediately is Tinker v. Des Moines, and we all know that really solidified the student right to free speech, so long as it does not disrupt a class. And I can't think of a reason why a student would not be able to question contents of a school library or the material in a teacher's curriculum. That said, I'm not entirely sure what the process would be for a student, especially if they're not an adult going through the more public routes. But I am positive that any student would be able to question their teacher or their librarian in a school about what they are choosing to have in their class or library, which I'm trying to think about more specifically how that would work. And I want to do more research on that later, but thank you for that question.
I can add to that. So in many cases, those bans have been kind of pushed back on and have been taken away. But the idea is, it really is that they're just about wanting to get the exposure and the intimidation of actually doing it in the first place, right? When someone fights against it, it takes months behind the scenes. And by the time that book is put back on the shelf, everybody's forgotten about it. So in essence, it does happen and books are put back on shelves, but the winning is the exposure of and the big bang of being on TV and talking about it right up when the book is actually banned. Then later on, they've moved on to something else.
Thank you for those answers. There's another question from a virtual attendee. This is some comments and question from Debbie. And so Debbie says, I want to ask about the learner's comfort. And there's some comments that she makes having to do with that. I hear that we don't want students to be uncomfortable as a rationale for limiting what students are exposed to, like censorship. For me, discomfort is an important part of learning about new and different ideas. It seems to me both the right and left condone censorship. What is your opinion about student comfort?
Well, as a student, I can say that I save maybe 1 or 2 lessons in a history class have not been made uncomfortable by what is being talked about. I feel as though it cannot be kind of a major argument for that side to be using that, oh, my child is going to be uncomfortable by what's talked about in class. That really doesn't happen in my experience, at least. Of course, there are uncomfortable lessons in your history class when we are having an open discussion about like colonization and the massacres, genocides that have occurred as a result, or if we're talking about World War II and the Holocaust. Those are, of course, uncomfortable lessons, but they make us better students because we're challenging if we have any, well, I mean, we do all have internal biases that we need to address, and those lessons can help with that by promoting the conversation. What I have found a lot with the uncomfort of the learner is in diversity education in particular. I recall when those debates were first starting to happen at the Rocky River School Board, people were saying that it's confusing their children, which is not true. It's a lie. I'll just call it as it is. Diversity education does not confuse people. It is clear. It, if anything, clarifies for people about how other people are different from them. Thank you.
And just one more statement on that. Imagine being so uncomfortable with your history that you make it illegal to read about it.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Thanks again, everyone. And let's give a round of applause to our speakers. And thank you to our audience for being so engaged and asking some great questions. So for you, I want you to go home and follow what Meryl said. Do your homework to fight these battles and vote accordingly. Let's get these people out of office if we can, and get people who really understand what we need. Next week, we'll take a break. We're going to have a monthly brunch by Harry's Kitchen Crew, which is always delicious. It's at 11:15, so we won't have a forum. Everyone is invited. In 2 weeks, on February 19th, Alex Chaka will tell us how the Western Reserve Land Conservancy conserves and restores natural land that might be under threat of development. You're welcome to attend today's service at 10:15, either upstairs in the sanctuary or on our website, uucleveland.org. The theme is to feel the suck from both sides. It's about loving and being loved. Our minister, Reverend Randy Partain, will be on the pulpit. If you haven't yet heard them preach and heard our music, you're in for a treat. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great week.